They don't belong here. The whisper was loud enough for the entire shop to hear the moment Daniel Hayes stepped inside. He stood alone, his heavy work clothes stained with grease and industrial oil. Every gaze in the room was a weapon, sharp, judging, and filled with silent condemnation. A female sales clerk glanced at him and let out a soft, mocking laugh. Daniel didn't say a word. He just stood his ground. At that exact moment, the shop owner emerged from the back. He stared at Daniel for 5 long seconds and then spoke. "Sir, it's an honor to have you here." Daniel Hayes was 36 years old, but his hands told the story of a man who had lived twice that long. They were thick, calloused, and permanently stained with the evidence of his difficult trade. Daniel was an industrial machine technician, a man who spoke the language of steel and electricity. He spent his days and nights deep inside the vibrating bellies of massive manufacturing plants. He repaired complex electrical grids, massive turbines, and intricate hydraulic systems. It was a brutal, bone-tiring job that left him smelling like a mixture of copper, burnt rubber, and sweat. But Daniel never uttered a single word of complaint about the physical toll his work took on him. Every drop of oil on his sleeve and every scar on his knuckles was a silent sacrifice. He did it for the only person who truly mattered in his universe, his 10-year-old daughter, Emma. Since his wife, Sarah, had passed away 5 years ago, Daniel had become Emma's entire world. He was a single father who lived in a constant cycle of duty and devotion to his child. He woke up at 4 a.m. every single morning to pack her healthy lunches and check her homework. He often stayed up until midnight studying technical blueprints or reading up on her school projects. Daniel was a man of very few words, preferring a quiet and modest life on the edge of the city. They lived in a small, 2-bedroom apartment that was always filled with the smell of home-cooked meals. Daniel didn't care for luxury, fancy cars, or the social status that obsessed so many people. He didn't have a single social media profile, and he hadn't worn a formal suit in over a decade. He lived by a simple, unyielding code. Protect your family, work until the job is done, and never lie. Emma was a bright, curious girl who saw her father through a lens of absolute heroic wonder. She didn't see the grease on his face or the dirt under his fingernails when he came home from work. She only saw the strength in his eyes and the gentle way he tucked her into bed every night. She often told her teachers with grey-eyed pride, "My dad can fix anything that is broken in the world." But recently, the world outside their small apartment had started to feel much more dangerous. Their neighborhood, once a quiet sanctuary, had been plagued by a sudden surge in crime. Late-night break-ins and local disturbances were becoming a regular topic of conversation at the market. Daniel felt a cold, sharp knot of anxiety in his stomach every time he left for a long night shift. He began to worry that his bare hands and his technical skills wouldn't be enough to keep Emma safe. He wasn't a violent man by nature, but he was a responsible and deeply protective father. After weeks of careful research and deep internal conflict, Daniel made a difficult decision. He decided it was time to find a definitive way to defend his home legally, safely, and effectively. He needed a reliable security solution, something that would give him true peace of mind. He wanted to know that when he was miles away at the factory, his daughter was secure. This was the specific reason he found himself standing in front of the glass doors of the Iron Citadel. It was known as the most prestigious and high-end gun shop and security firm in the entire state. The Citadel was a place of polished glass, expensive walnut counters, and the latest tactical gear. As Daniel pushed open the heavy, reinforced glass doors, he felt like a ghost entering a cathedral. He was acutely aware that he didn't fit into this world of high-priced hobbies and elite shooters. He knew his dusty, heavy work boots looked terribly out of place on the expensive plush carpet, but he adjusted the collar of his faded work jacket and stepped forwards with a steady gaze. He wasn't there for his own ego, and he wasn't there to play a character for the people watching. He was there for Emma, and that was all the motivation he needed to endure the coming storm. He walked toward the main service counter, ignoring the cold air and the scent of expensive gun oil. Daniel kept his head held high, though he could feel the temperature in the room drop instantly. He didn't look at the other customers, who were dressed in designer hunting gear and tailored wear. He was a man out of his element, a blue-collar worker in a world of gold-plated security. But in Daniel's world, a mission was something you never abandoned until it was successfully finished. Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. The silence that followed Daniel's entrance into the shop was heavy, cold, and suffocating. At the far end of the long store, a group of wealthy-looking men stopped their conversation to stare. They looked at Daniel's tattered work pants and the dark grease smudges on his forehead with disgust. To them, he was a biological hazard, an intruder who had wandered into the wrong neighborhood. The Iron Citadel was more than a store. It was an elite club for those with deep pockets and status. Daniel, in his raw industrial reality, looked like an unwelcome stain on their polished perfection. A young, sharp-featured sales clerk named Vanessa slowly approached the main glass counter. She was dressed in a crisp, professional uniform, her hair perfectly styled in a tight bun. She didn't offer a polite greeting or even a simple nod as she stopped several feet away from him. Instead, she scanned Daniel from his worn-out leather boots all the way up to his tired, steady eyes. She didn't see a devoted father trying to protect his child. She saw a man who was below her. She assumed he couldn't afford even the cheapest cleaning supplies for the items displayed on her shelves. "Can I help you with something specific?" Vanessa asked, her voice dripping with professional sarcasm. She spoke as if each word was a chore, leaning back away from him to avoid the faint smell of oil. Daniel ignored the biting tone, having dealt with arrogant foremen and difficult clients his whole life. He spoke politely and clearly, his voice deep and vibrating with a natural, grounded calmness. "I'm looking for a total home security solution," Daniel said, looking her directly in the eyes. "Something reliable and safe for a household where a young child lives alone with her father." "I've done some preliminary reading on the secure lock series you carry here," he continued, "but I would really like to see the different hardware options in person before I make a choice." Vanessa let out a short, dry, and insulting laugh, loud enough for every person in the shop to hear. "The Secure Lock series is our most premium high-tech line, sir. It's a very significant investment. It's highly technical, and to be perfectly frank, it requires a certain level of financial stability. Perhaps you'd be much more comfortable at the Army surplus store on the other side of town." A man standing nearby, who was holding an expensive custom Italian shotgun, joined in the mockery. "Maybe he's just looking for a heavy pipe wrench to keep under his bed," he whispered to his friend. They both chuckled, watching Daniel as if he were an actor in a play they found mildly amusing. The air in the shop became thick and toxic with the weight of their collective social judgment. Vanessa didn't even bother to reach for her keys to open the heavy glass display case in front of her. She just stood there, tapping her long, polished nails on the glass with an air of bored impatience. She was waiting for Daniel to finally take the obvious hint and leave the building so she could return to her real clients. She assumed he was lost, looking for a bathroom, or perhaps hoping to find a discarded part in the trash. Daniel felt the familiar sharp sting of being looked down upon, but he didn't flinch or lower his head. He thought of Emma's small face when she heard a branch scrape against her window at night. He thought of the solemn promise he had made to his late wife to always be the shield for their daughter. He stayed rooted to the spot, his posture straight and his hands resting calmly on the walnut counter. "I understand the level of investment required," Daniel said quietly, his voice gaining a hard edge. "And I understand the technology. I'm specifically interested in the biometric fail-safe systems. I want to know about the response time of the secondary firing pin blocks and the encryption level." Vanessa sighed loudly, looking at her gold watch as if she were counting the seconds until he vanished. She was losing her patience and felt that Daniel's presence was ruining the elite vibe of the store. "Look, I have actual serious buyers waiting for my attention," Vanessa snapped, crossing her arms. "Why don't you go home and clean up a bit? This is a professional establishment, not a garage." Daniel started to respond, but the words felt heavy in his mouth as the entire room stared at him. He realized that in this room, no amount of technical knowledge would overcome the grease on his shirt. He felt a moment of profound, crushing isolation. A good man being treated like trash for working an honest job. He felt the eyes of the wealthy hobbyist burning into his back, waiting for him to tuck his tail and run. But before he could turn to walk out into the cold evening air, the heavy door to the back office opened. A man stepped out, and the entire atmosphere of the Iron Citadel changed in a fraction of a second. The judgment, the laughter, and the arrogance were about to collide with a reality they weren't ready for. Daniel didn't know the owner, but the owner clearly knew him, and the lesson was about to begin. The room was about to learn that the man they were mocking was the most important person in the building. Have you ever been judged like this? Comment respect if you understand. The owner of the Iron Citadel, a retired colonel named Silas Vance, walked slowly onto the floor. He was a man with stark white hair and eyes that looked like they had seen every dark corner of the world. He moved with a noticeable limp, but his presence was so massive that the room seemed to shrink around him. He didn't look at Vanessa, and he didn't acknowledge the wealthy customers who were trying to catch his eye. He walked straight toward the man in the grease-stained jumpsuit, his boots clicking on the hard floor. Vanessa hurried over to her voice suddenly high-pitched and sweet, trying to justify herself. "Mr. Vance, sir, I was just explaining to this man that our premium inventory is currently on backorder. I was suggesting he try a more suitable location for his budget so we could focus on our main clients." Silas Vance raised a single, scarred hand, silencing her so effectively that she actually stepped backward. He looked at Daniel's face for a long time, then at his calloused hands, then at a small, faded tattoo on his arm. It was a tactical unit insignia that everyone else in the room had completely ignored or failed to recognize. Then Silas Vance did something that made Vanessa's jaw drop and the entire room fall into a deep silence. He stepped forward, stood at attention for a brief second, and then bowed his head with genuine respect. "Daniel Hayes," Silas said, his voice deep and echoing against the high ceilings of the shop. "Sir, it's an absolute honor to have you back in my shop. I didn't know you were in this part of the state." The entire store went into a freeze moment. The laughing customers stopped their mocking mid-breath. Vanessa stood perfectly paralyzed, her face turning from a smug red to a ghostly, sickly shade of white. But before anyone could ask a single question about who this grease monkey was, a disaster struck. A high-pitched, piercing alarm began to blare from the hidden speakers in the walls and the ceiling. The shop's OmniGuard system, a multi-million-dollar network, had suddenly suffered a catastrophic malfunction. Red strobe lights began to flash violently across the room, reflecting off the glass and the polished steel. The heavy motorized steel shutters at the main entrance slammed shut with the force of a falling hammer. Everyone was instantly locked inside the building. The store's automated voice began to chant, "Critical system failure. Security lockdown initiated. The police notified. Do not move." Vanessa began to panic, her professional facade crumbling as she sprinted toward the main computer terminal. "The server is stuck in an infinite loop. I can't override the locks. The main vault is sealing." If the secondary vault sealed, hundreds of thousands of dollars in sensitive, explosive inventory would be trapped. The timer for a critical lockdown was 72 hours, and the air filtration system was not engaging. More importantly, the customers were beginning to panic in the red light, feeling the walls close in on them. Silas Vance reached for his encrypted radio, but the electromagnetic interference was too loud to hear anything. "The factory technical team is 40 minutes away in the city," Silas growled, his face etched with worry. "We can't wait that long. If the pressure seals engage, we'll be trapped in here with a fire hazard." Daniel Hayes didn't wait for an invitation or an order from the owner. He moved with a sudden, lethal grace. He stepped behind the counter, physically pushing Vanessa aside as she tried to block his path to the server. He looked at the flashing red lights on the main control panel for exactly 3 seconds. He wasn't looking at the error messages on the screen. He was looking at the hardware underneath. He noticed the erratic, high-frequency pulsing of the status lights on the secondary power bridge. "It's not a software hack or a virus," Daniel said, his voice calm and authoritative over the sirens. "It's a phase frequency misalignment in your backup power supply. The secondary battery is fighting the grid. It's creating a massive feedback loop that's frying the logic gates on your security controller." Vanessa looked at him with disbelieving eyes. You can't possibly know that. This is military tech. That system is encrypted with 28-bit security. You're just a repairman." Daniel didn't bother to answer her. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his heavy industrial ring of keys. Attached to the keys was a high-grade multi-tool and the small faded star keychain Emma had made. With a speed that suggested a lifetime of high-pressure technical experience, Daniel opened the access panel. He didn't use a keyboard. He used a small piece of copper wire to manually bypass the digital lock. He began to reconfigure the power sequence by hand, stripping wires and rerouting the bypass circuits. His hands, the same hands Vanessa had laughed at, moved with the terrifying precision of a combat surgeon. Within 90 seconds of him touching the wires, the blaring, painful alarms suddenly died out. The red strobe lights turned a steady, peaceful green, and the heavy steel shutters began to rise. The OmniGuard system breathed a mechanical sigh of relief and returned to its normal operating state. Silas Vance stood there, a small, knowing smile playing on his lips as he watched the crowd's reaction. He looked at Vanessa, then at the wealthy customers who were now shaking with embarrassment. "You all saw a man with grease on his clothes and dirt on his boots," Silas said, his voice low and dangerous. "But I see the chief systems engineer who saved my entire battalion's communications grid in the desert. 5 years ago, this man maintained the most complex security systems the United States military owns. If it wasn't for the technical genius of Daniel Hayes, I wouldn't be standing here today. And this shop would have been a pile of ash a long time ago. Show him some damn respect." The revelation hit the room like a physical explosion. The maintenance man was a living legend. The people who had been laughing only minutes ago were now staring at their own shoes in shame. Vanessa felt like she was going to collapse. She had almost kicked out the savior of the company. Daniel Hayes simply closed the access panel and stood up, wiping his hands on a clean rag Silas handed him. "Do you think people judge Daniel too quickly? Tell us your thoughts below." The heavy, awkward silence that followed Silas's words was different from the silence at the beginning. It wasn't the silence of arrogant judgment. It was the silence of deep, profound, and painful shame. One of the customers who had made the comment about the wrench walked slowly over to Daniel. He looked at his $5,000 Italian shoes, then up at Daniel's grease-stained, honest face. I want to sincerely apologize to you, sir," the man muttered, his voice cracking with regret. "I was completely out of line. I didn't know who you were, and I had no right to talk to you that way." Daniel didn't look for a fight, and he didn't look for revenge. He didn't even look for a public apology. He just nodded his head once, a gesture of quiet, unbreakable dignity that made the man feel even smaller. "It's not about who I am or what I did in the service," Daniel said softly, his voice echoing in the shop. "It's about who you think you are when you choose to look down on another human being for their work." Vanessa stood behind the counter, her hands trembling so hard she had to hide them behind her back. She walked slowly toward Daniel, her face flushed a deep, painful red with total embarrassment. "Mr. Hayes, Daniel, I am so incredibly sorry," she whispered, her eyes filling with tears of regret. "I was arrogant, blind, and cruel. I judged you because I thought my uniform made me better than you. I was wrong. I was so very wrong. Please allow me to help you find exactly what you need for your home. I will personally ensure you get the highest level of protection we have, and it will be at my expense." Daniel looked at the counter, then at Silas, who was watching him with a look of immense pride. "I don't want the equipment for free, Vanessa," Daniel said firmly, his voice steady as a rock. "I worked hard for my money at the factory, and I take pride in paying my own way in this life. I pay for my daughter's safety with the sweat of my own brow. I just want the best solution for her." Silas Vance pushed Vanessa aside with a gentle but firm hand and spent the next hour with Daniel. He personally walked Daniel through every high-tech, biometric security option in the entire building. He showed him the silent safes that only opened for a father's thumbprint and a specific retinal scan. He showed him the encrypted home monitoring systems that were impossible for any criminal to hack. Silas gave Daniel the official military legend discount, reducing the astronomical price by 60%. But Daniel still insisted on paying the remaining balance in full, using the money he had saved for months. He pulled out a thick stack of folded bills, earned through countless hours of overtime in the factory. Every person in the store, the staff and the wealthy hobbyists alike, watched him with a new reverence. They didn't see a grease monkey anymore. They saw a father who would go to the ends of the earth for his kid. They saw a man who didn't need an expensive suit or a title to be the most powerful person in the room. Vanessa watched him as he carefully loaded the high-tech security system into a heavy cardboard box. She realized that she had just met the most important man who had ever walked through those glass doors, and she had almost kicked him out because he looked like a man who worked for a living. She made a silent promise to herself that she would never judge another soul by their cover again. Would you apologize if you were in Vanessa's position? Comment yes or no. As Daniel Hayes walked out of the heavy glass doors of the Iron Citadel, the sun was setting, the sky was a bruised purple and orange, and the heavy box in his arms felt surprisingly light. He had done exactly what he had set out to do that afternoon. He had a way to keep Emma safe. He walked to his old, dented pickup truck, which was parked right next to a row of gleaming luxury cars. He took a deep breath of the cool evening air, feeling a sense of peace he hadn't known in months. He didn't feel like a hero, and he didn't feel like the legendary systems engineer Silas described. To the rest of the world, he was just a technician, but to himself, he was simply a day going home. On the drive back to his apartment, Daniel looked at the star-shaped keychain hanging from the ignition. He thought about Silas Vance and the shocked faces of the people in the elite gun shop. He realized that the world would always try to put people in convenient little boxes based on their looks. But he also knew that as long as he had the respect of his daughter, the world's opinion didn't matter. When he finally walked through the front door of his small apartment, Emma ran to meet him. She didn't smell the industrial oil on his clothes, and she didn't see the grease on his tired forehead. She just felt her father's strength as she wrapped her small arms around his waist and hugged him. "Did you fix the world today, Daddy?" Emma asked with a bright, gap-toothed grin. Daniel knelt down on the floor and kissed her forehead, the weight of the day finally lifting. "No, sweetie," Daniel whispered, his voice full of love. "I just fixed a little bit of our world." That night, as Daniel installed the new biometric security system, he felt a profound sense of calm. He knew that some people would always see a janitor or a grease monkey when they looked at him, but he also knew that the most powerful thing a man can ever truly own is his own integrity. He didn't need to prove his worth to the people in the gun shop with words or a fancy bank account. His actions during the system crash had already spoken for him, louder than a shout ever could. Daniel Hayes went to sleep that night, knowing his daughter was safe behind a wall of high-tech steel. He was a single dad, an industrial technician, and a veteran who had forgotten more than most knew. But most importantly, he was a man who knew that a little bit of grease couldn't hide a hero's soul. The Iron Citadel would never forget the name Daniel Hayes, and neither would the people who witnessed it. Human beings are often blinded by the surface of things, focusing on the wrapper instead of the gift. We live in a judgmental world that values the brand of a shirt more than the heart beating beneath it. We judge others based on the model of their car or the dirt under their fingernails after a long shift. But the story of Daniel Hayes serves as a powerful reminder that true value is found in character. Daniel didn't need to shout to be heard, and he didn't need to brag about his past to earn respect. He simply showed up when things were broken, and he had the quiet confidence to fix them. The next time you see someone who looks like they don't belong in a fancy room, remember Daniel. Remember that the person you are tempted to look down on might be the only one who can save you. Respect isn't something you give to people based on their bank balance or the clothes they wear. It is something you owe to every human being who works hard, loves their family, and does the right thing. If you believe that respect is earned through a person's actions and not their appearance, subscribe to Hidden Heart Stories for more powerful stories about everyday heroes. Thank you for watching, and always remember to look for the hero behind the grease.